Yeah, I think it was February 2001 when the Vice President of Unocal Oil Company testified to a subcommittee in Congress and said the Taliban's not cooperating. We need a pipeline for the huge Caspian Basin reserves. The United States needs that oil. And of course, we've read since that the Unocal got the major contract now to construct that pipeline, and that there are U.S. bases going along the pipeline. Did you have any indication of that when you were there? Did you hear anything about the pipeline? Was it?
I did not, but that doesn't mean anything. I was only in Kabul and only for several days, and I had no reason to. But I have been in a room in Washington D.C. with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who proudly boasts of having provoked the Soviet Union into Afghanistan in 1979. And says, I don't care if we caused a civil war or terrorist groups or 9/11 or anything else, we hurt the Soviet Union, which is, maybe they did a little bit, but this guy Brzezinski is laying out publicly, openly, what the reasons are for never leaving Afghanistan. This was a couple years ago now, and among his top 10 reasons is the pipeline. We need the pipeline. I mean, the real reasons for wars are rarely secret, literally secret. I mean, they're just not repeated over and over again on the front page and drilled into everybody's heads by the televisions. But they're not, they're not literally secret. There are things that you discover decades later, but for the most part, it's right there for the looking, and there's no reason for anyone to dispute that the pipeline is a big factor, but they don't have to. There's nobody talking about it on our airwaves, right? So I think it helps for people to get educated, but I think that most of the Americans who are among that majority who oppose this war do so despite being horribly misinformed and having no idea how nasty our history is in this country. Yes?
So, are we going to get out of there ever?
Yeah. I mean, the U.S. empire is going to die softly or violently, one way or another. Empires don't last. If Afghanistan holds to its reputation, it will have a big role to play. It has killed off empires in the past, and they chased several out of there before the British or the Soviets. But how fast we'll get out of there, I don't know. I mean, most Americans think we left Iraq already, and we still have war raging in Iraq. And if Americans can be persuaded that we left Afghanistan without leaving, then we will be leaving much more slowly. So keeping on top of the information and spreading the information is key. But pressuring our government, we're going to have to step it up several notches. We in this town went from having a Republican congressman who was just, I mean, he embarrassed the Republicans. He was so offensive. I mean, he couldn't decide if he hated the Muslims more than the Mexicans or which was which. And we put in a guy who spoke well, had been to school, said nice things in private, and he voted for every war dollar he could get his hands on, eagerly, proudly, and had no interest whatsoever in opposing the military machine. And yet the peace movement, I would say at least as much as was typical on the national scale, just died in this district and this town because he was a Democrat. Now we're back to having a Republican, but the peace movement had already died, and the president was already from the good party, and he even had a peace prize, so he had to be for peace. And the peace movement hasn't come back to where it was yet. So, as long as we are that easily manipulated, we have a whole change of thinking we have to go through before we're going to mobilize the pressure that's needed. Yes, way back there.
Our family just loves children, and when the Taliban, when the villages were falling, my daughter-in-law went to Afghanistan, and she stayed with the children and came back to Charlottesville and did a clothing drive. With her, she has real dark skin. She's from Sri Lanka, so she was able to wear. She kind of fit it. She was a little bit too dark, but governments. My other daughter, she was in Myanmar. Burma is now, and this was an oil thing where there was no place for these little children to go. She was hiding underneath hay, trying to get from, you can't really call them refugee camps because both sides wanted to kill them. But anyway, we are, you were right when you said, will the thing be over? It will only be over. It's so dark there that it will take just America failing for it to be over. It's not something that they're going to lose. You know, it's just because it's so dark. And when you said evil a little while ago, I mean, the most healthy thing that people can do is just find the smallest and try to help the smallest. That's the most building, strengthening thing that any culture can do, is help the weakest and the smallest, and that culture becomes stronger and stronger. And you're talking about Republicans or Democrats. When you look at that philosophy that I'm talking about, I vote. I wouldn't care who it was. I would vote for anybody that was not going to kill a child. And the fact that abortion has gotten to be an older and older age, even killing children half-born, it is, I would vote for anyone that was going to not do that. The elderly and the tiniest of us, a culture that takes care of the helpless is a culture that gets stronger and survives.
And that's not our culture at the moment, although there are those pushing it in the right direction. We're locking up more people than anyone else on the planet. We're waging more wars than anyone else on the planet. We have a higher rate of violence than any other wealthy country. We have a long ways to go, but I think what you've described of people going over and visiting and caring for children, if everybody went and spent a week or a month in another country, especially in a poor country, and came back, there would be no more wars. This is why I wanted to show Afghan films in this country. This is why I want to create pressure to demand that these young peacemakers in Afghanistan get visas to come here, because I'm reluctant to draw statistical conclusions from having met a relatively small number of people, but those people that I met and their stories and their images are just in my brain in a way that will never leave, that doesn't happen from books or television. And I think, making those personal connections, would change everything.
Yeah, you just mentioned Iraq, and I'd really be interested in hearing what you have to say about Iraq, because, like I say, at the moment we're engaged in two major wars. One of the big differences between these two wars and other wars in the past is we've got few of our population actually engaged in them, because of the high technology we're using. It's like something like 1% or 2%, say, where in the Second World War was like 25%, Civil War was 50%. And so in a way, the population impact is a little bit less. I mean, we have fewer body bags coming back, but that, for most of the population, is all they're going to see of the war. But the kind of thing that worries about me is it's like this twofold shift in government, which is kind of like having a major impact on this. And one is the for-profit theory on actually people engaged in warfare. So it's not so much military anymore, but it's actually mercenary. Blackwater, etc., that kind of thing. And the second question is, there seems to be a lot more control at home now. I mean, 50, 60 years ago, it was the WIT, it was the camp, it was this, that. Today, control of populations by government is more through media, advertisements, and just all sorts of little fundamental ways to sort of make people think in a kind of way that is more amenable to the government. And therefore, something like the peace process, the peace groups are going to die out, whatever, as hopefully, according to the government, just by the way that they're going, what they want, whether it's Democrat or Republican. I mean, the Republicans came back. Are these peace groups really going to bounce back in? I mean, the conditions won't be that much different, whether it's a Democrat running the White House or the Republicans. It's still going to be the same war. They're going to still be going to do the same thing.
Well, there are some weaknesses in their plot for domination. Americans are more educated and informed and skeptical about wars now than ever. Turn against wars more quickly. We had opinion, just in polls, not in action, turning against the war in Libya more quickly than any previous war. We have had strong resistance to launching a war on Iran, largely because of the similarity between the lies there and the lies that were used about Iraq. In Iraq, there was this treaty made by Bush and Maliki without asking the Senate, completely unconstitutional. You can't call it anything other than a treaty, for 3 more years of war, and then everybody out by the end of this year, 2011. There's a nice little loophole because it's everybody who works for the Department of so-called Defense. So if you hire an army of mercenaries through the State Department, and then you put in the world's biggest embassy ever in the capital, you're in complete compliance with the treaty. Whether you are in sufficient compliance not to outrage the Iraqis remains to be seen. But that's not what they're talking about doing. They're talking about leaving 10,000 or 20,000 or 40,000 troops, plus, no doubt, the contractors that go along. We have typically as many mercenaries and contractors as troops, if not more, now, which is part of how they enlarge the military. They will not have a draft. They will end wars before they'll have a draft. It's the very last thing they'll do. I don't want one, but they won't do it. They will hire mercenaries. They will hire foreign mercenaries. They will ruin the economy. They will up the bonuses. They will up the recruiting spending and the propaganda. They will take people younger and older and sicker and dumber, and they will do everything they can to avoid a draft. And they will keep this machine going, more and more privatized, more and more mercenary, which means more and more profit. And at the same time, we're changing the electoral system so more and more of those profits can go back to the politicians to keep the thing moving in the same direction. But in Iraq, Congress, which now has been completely erased from the picture by Libya, although Congressman Kucinich, who I used to work for, is now putting in a bill that won't pass that would end the war in Libya, which it is Congress's right to do. But Congress members and peace groups, for the most part, said, oh my God, a treaty that ends the war. Well, yeah, there's 3 more years of killing and dying, but it ends the war. Let's take this. Let's not object to this. Well, Congress ought to have spoken up and said, we have to say yes or no to this. That's in the Constitution. We're the people's representatives. They didn't say a word. Among those protesting and saying that was a guy who's now vice president. But they let it go. And now we're looking at this deadline of the end of this year with, in all probability, our puppet president of Iraq being persuaded to invite American troops outside of the mercenaries and the State Department to stay, and hell breaking loose in Iraq. But not enough hell, you're absolutely right, to persuade Americans that their friends and neighbors are all dying. And so if we're ever going to break out of this, we're going to have to start caring about and learning about other people dying. Right? And when we read our newspapers and they tell us the U.S. war with the greatest cost in human life was the Civil War, we ought to be raising hell. When we read our newspapers and we see the total death count from Iraq, and it's just Americans, which are less than 1% of the death count in Iraq, I mean, as decent human beings, as adherents of any moral philosophy other than, you know, psychotic mass murder, we ought to be protesting the fact that we aren't told the fundamental result of the largest thing we spend our money on as a people, right? And when we are told, we ought to care. As if we don't start caring that we're killing other people who don't look like us or talk like us, then if they keep this machine going this way, and automated and unmanned wars with drones, then, you know, if we can't end wars until our neighbors are all dying in them, we're not going to end the wars, but we're going to end the environment, the economy, the empire. The blowback is going to kill us. The nuclear proliferation is going to kill us. We're going to end life on this planet. We're just not going to end the wars anytime soon. Does anybody have a question who hasn't asked one yet? Okay.
So David, Kathy was talking about it. Kathy Kelly last week was talking about a checklist, and you're kind of alluding to a checklist of, you know, really needing to and supporting alternative media. What is your thought about looking at local defense contractors here in Charlottesville, whether it be north of Grumman or General Dynamics or others that are really benefiting? You know, the big word of profiteering. There are so many hands involved. Is that on a checklist? Is that a strategy that you've considered or know others that are currently working on?
Well, I don't think we have any, just to quibble over language, because I don't think we have any companies building anything defensive in Charlottesville. But you're calling it what they all call it, what it's officially called, the Department of Defense, and that's what they all say it is. And I do think that's one of the most important things we should be doing. We have this conference planned for September 16th to 19th, that's, or 16th to 18th, that's on flyers on all the chairs. And we planned it for this week because the Charlottesville Center for Peace and Justice is looking at doing a week of events leading up to the International Day of Peace later that week. And one thing that we've talked about doing is holding events at, you know, the front doors of some of the bigger weapons makers and military operations in this area, having a series of those and educating people about those, and then in an early part of this 3 days of workshops and panels and entertainment, talking about the local military, industrial, university, congressional, entertainment, chemical complex, because most people don't know. I certainly don't have a very specific idea, and I've been assigned to research this, and I hope you'll help me, exactly who's spending what here, including how much is going through the university and their research park and the Army Ground Intelligence Center and so forth. But I think it's important that people understand that it is the biggest part of our economy, that we are not just the biggest military, spending more than everybody else put together on our military. We could cut 85% of our military and still have the biggest one, and we can't find a credible enemy in sight. But beyond that, we sell most of the weapons to the other people that we fight with our military. We are far and away a leading seller of weapons to the rest of the world. It is our big industry. It is what we do, and it's everywhere. You know, and I go around the country talking, and everybody says, "Oh, you know, this is really a military town." No, this is an American town. Every town in this country is a military town, and they don't all know it. Some of them do, and so I think it is important. But then I don't think that we should allow turning that around to say, well, we have to support this as an economic program, right? Which is why they build one weapon in 46 congressional districts, so they can have jobs for all of those Congress members. People, the problem is that for the same dollar, you could have many more jobs and many better paying jobs and a broader impact on the economy. And there's not much dispute about this among economists if you put the same money into peaceful industries, into education and infrastructure and energy and so forth. So we have to convert from this machine to nonviolent economic industries, but we have to know it's there first before we can convert it. Maybe one last question, and then we'll break up and talk.
I'd like to present a hypothetical. If in the future it is proven and officially acknowledged that a small element of the U.S. intelligence community, the U.S. military, and the U.S. civil government was involved in the 9/11 attacks, what do you think would be the reaction of the Afghan people, the Taliban, the government?
92% of the Afghan fighters have not heard yet about the 9/11 attacks. You're talking about an illiterate society with nothing to do, no work. They have radio, and there are those who get the BBC, and there are those who are better informed than we are. But for the most part, this is a society isolated in little valleys out in the middle of nowhere. And not only are they not cheering for and taking credit for the 9/11 attacks or denouncing them and opposing whoever's responsible, they haven't heard about them yet. So I don't think there would be much of an impact on it. Just to go on quickly with language, I don't think the intelligence community is much of a community. And I don't think it deserves, much as I like people like Ray McGovern who used to work in that madness, I don't think it deserves another dollar. I think it needs to be shut down. When President Obama went around the Congress and around the UN resolution that allowed him supposedly to go around the Congress and secretly told the CIA that they could arm the rebels in Libya if they wanted to, he was telling a government agency that's supposed to learn stuff that it could go arm a military sufficiently to defeat another military we'd helped arm. That's some serious, unaccountable money doing some serious damage that has nothing to do with intelligence or even stupidity. It's just criminal. And certainly it is not above taking part in any sort of crime. They've taken part in crimes far worse than anything you've mentioned, but I don't think if it would have a big impact on Afghan public opinion if there is such a thing. But thanks for the great questions and for coming out here.